Welcome. Tonight, we drift back in time to an age when the skies wept and the oceans rose. An age of silence, of storm, and of second chances. Across cultures, across centuries, one story has endured. A story whispered by firelight, etched into stone, carried in dreams. A great flood, a world washed clean, and the quiet strength of those who chose to begin again. This is not a tale of fear. It is a tale of remembering, of resilience, of renewal. So close your eyes, let your breath slow, and allow the waters of history to carry you gently through the echoes of the great flood. You are safe. You are warm. You are not alone. Let the story begin. Long ago, in a time, before the great kingdoms of men rose and fell, before the stones of pyramids kissed the sky, and the first stories were etched into clay, there was water and silence. It is said by countless cultures across the earth that a deluge once came, a flood so vast, so unstoppable, that it erased nearly everything. The Great Flood, they called it, the day the old world drowned and a new world was born. But how could such a story survive the march of time? Why does nearly every ancient culture, from the mountains of Peru to the plains of Mesopotamia, from the icy lands of the Norse to the spiritual heart of India, speak of a flood? It is more than a myth. It is a memory. An echo of a time when humanity stood at the edge of extinction, clinging to floating remnants of what was once civilization. Our journey begins in the mists of prehistory, in a world where the seas had not yet swallowed their secrets, and where the sky still wept for what it had lost. Before writing, before history as we know it, there were the storytellers, those who remembered. Their tales became the foundation for epic legends. And in every one of them, the flood looms. In Mesopotamia, one of the oldest written stories ever discovered, the Epic of Gilgamesh, speaks of a man named Utnapishtim. The gods, angered by the noise and chaos of mankind, decided to cleanse the earth. But one god, compassionate and kind, warned Utnapishtim, instructing him to build a massive boat to survive the coming storm. He did, and as the rains fell for days and nights unending, he drifted over a drowned world, a solitary witness to the end of an age. Millennia later, the Hebrew Bible would tell a strikingly similar story of Noah, his ark, and a God who, seeing corruption and violence, chose to begin again. This story, written down thousands of years after Gilgamesh, carries uncanny parallels. The warnings, the measurements of the ark, the release of birds to search for land, and above all, the rainbow, a symbol of hope after devastation. Yet this is not unique to the Near East. In India, the sacred text of the Satapatha Brahmana recounts how Manu, the progenitor of mankind, was warned by a talking fish, an incarnation of the god Vishnu, of an oncoming flood. Manu built a boat, fastened it to the horn of the fish, and survived the destruction of the world. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha floated in a chest across a sea that had consumed the earth, later repopulating humanity with stones thrown over their shoulders. Among the Maya of Mesoamerica, there were tales of previous worlds destroyed by floods, worlds that came before the current one, each ending in disaster. In Aboriginal Australia, the Great Flood is remembered in songlines passed down through generations, marking where the waters once surged and receded. In Chinese legend, the hero Yu tames the floodwaters that had covered the land, a task so great it took him years and defined an entire age. So many stories, so many voices across the earth, separated by oceans and ages, yet all whispering the same tale. Could they all be wrong? Or are they telling us, in their own ways, about something we have forgotten? Science, too, has its theories. As the last ice age ended, around 12,000 years ago, glaciers melted at a staggering rate. Sea levels rose rapidly, reshaping coastlines and swallowing lowlands. Entire regions that had once been fertile and populated became seabeds. It is estimated that the oceans rose by over 120 meters during this period, enough to submerge vast areas and dramatically alter human life. Perhaps our ancestors did not simply imagine the flood. Perhaps they lived through it. In the Black Sea region, evidence suggests that a massive influx of water from the Mediterranean might have created a cataclysmic event, one that could have inspired flood legends throughout the ancient Near East. Geological layers of flood deposits in ancient settlements hint at sudden disasters, sudden drownings of once thriving civilizations. And yet, the flood stories speak not only of water, but of rebirth. They speak of a reset, a cleansing of the earth, a purging of corruption, a chance to begin again. They are not just warnings, they are promises that even in the darkest of times, life continues, that what is lost can be rebuilt, and that humanity, though fragile, always endures. As we drift through this tale, let your mind wander. Let it imagine ancient cities now buried beneath waves, ships bobbing under stormy skies, and quiet survivors watching the sunrise over a world made new. This is not just a story of destruction. It is a story of hope, of memory, and of the endless dance between nature and civilization. And so the waters begin to rise. As the waters crept over the land, swallowing forests and villages, it wasn't just buildings and people that were lost. It was memory. Oral traditions, knowledge passed from elder to child for generations, were drowned in silence. But those who survived, those who endured, carried the stories forward, reshaped by new tongues, new gods, and new lands. The flood became not just an event, but a symbol, a line drawn through time, dividing what was from what would be. Imagine for a moment a world before the flood, lush valleys, strange creatures now extinct, peoples whose names we no longer know. Some believe these people lived in harmony with the earth, their cities built with a wisdom we can barely comprehend. There are whispers of ancient technology, lost sciences, and golden ages buried beneath silt and sea. Were these merely myths, or the echoes of real forgotten civilizations? Many have speculated about Atlantis, the fabled island spoken of by Plato, which he claimed vanished beneath the waves in a single day and night of misfortune. While Plato's tale was meant to illustrate philosophical ideas, others have taken it literally, pointing to underwater ruins, maps of old coastlines, and ancient architecture that defies easy explanation. Could Atlantis have been real? Could it have been one of many places destroyed in a global cataclysm? Off the coast of India, beneath the Gulf of Kambat, sonar scans revealed structures that some researchers believe may be the remains of an ancient city now submerged. If confirmed, it would be tens of thousands of years older than any known civilization. In the Caribbean, near Cuba, divers have discovered what appear to be symmetrical stone structures deep beneath the sea, too deep to have been built by any known culture in the last 10 millennia. In the Mediterranean, off the coasts of Greece and Egypt, ancient harbors and buildings lie submerged, not by human error, but by rising waters. Japan's Yonaguni Monument, a massive underwater structure with sharp angles and terraces, continues to baffle geologists and historians alike. Some argue it is natural. Others insist it was carved by human hands in a forgotten age. Perhaps the flood was not a single event, but many, unfolding over centuries as glaciers melted and oceans rose. Sudden tsunamis, caused by underwater landslides or celestial impacts, may have added terror to an already shifting world. A comet strike, theorized by some to have hit North America around 800 years ago, could have triggered fires, extinctions, and sudden floods, setting the stage for the legends that followed. But why do these stories persist? Why, thousands of years later, do we still speak of arks and survivors, of gods and punishment? Perhaps because, at a deep level, the flood speaks to something fundamental in us. A fear of nature's power, yes, but also a longing for renewal. The idea that when things fall apart, they can be rebuilt, better, purer, wiser. In ancient Sumer, one of humanity's first civilizations, the flood marked the end of an age. Kingship, they said, descended from the heavens, but after the flood, it was given anew. The Sumerian king list records a time before the flood when kings ruled for thousands of years, a mythic age of giants and demigods. After the waters receded, human life was measured differently, shorter, more fragile, and perhaps more precious. The flood did not just wash away the old, it created space for something new. In every version of the story, those who survive become the ancestors of future generations. They bring with them seeds, animals, wisdom, and above all, the story itself. The flood becomes a fire of memory, passed on not to be forgotten, but to be learned from. Even in cultures that do not dwell on guilt or punishment, the flood is a turning point. In Chinese legend, it is not sin that causes the flood, but imbalance. And it is through perseverance and moral strength that humanity overcomes it. The hero Yu works tirelessly, not to escape the flood, but to tame it, to dig channels and canals, guiding the waters instead of fleeing them. It is a story not of destruction, but of harmony restored. In Native American traditions, the flood often serves as a cleansing. Among the Hopi, the people were saved by beings called the Ant People, who sheltered them underground while the surface was washed clean. When they returned, they were wiser, humbler, and more connected to the land. In this view, the flood is not an end, but a necessary pause, a rebalancing of the cosmic order. As the flood waters recede in each story, what is left behind is not simply ruin, but the potential for rebirth. The soil, washed of toxins, becomes fertile again. The sky clears. Animals return, and humanity, though smaller in number, carries a deeper understanding, a chance to live better, to remember the mistakes of the past, and to honor the forces greater than ourselves. It is no coincidence that some of the most profound spiritual teachings arise in the aftermath of these tales. The covenant in the Bible, the law codes of Mesopotamia, the moral teachings of early Indian texts, all find fertile ground in the world after the flood. It is as if the destruction wiped away not just corruption, but confusion, clearing the way for clarity. And so we float, suspended in this story, between the past and the future, watching as the world is washed clean. The rain still falls, but there is a break in the clouds. Somewhere, a dove is released into the air, searching for dry land. The dove flies, its wings slicing through the damp air, searching for proof that life can begin again. And as it returns with a small branch, fresh and green, it carries more than a token of dry land. It brings a symbol of hope. Across every version of the flood myth, there is a moment like this, a sign from nature that the storm has passed, that the earth is ready to receive life once more. Imagine what the world must have looked like in those early days after the deluge. The landscape would be unrecognizable. Rivers carved new paths, mountainsides stripped bare, forests flattened, and coastlines redrawn. Survivors, few and scattered, would have had to rebuild from the mud and memory. In these raw and humbled beginnings, the seeds of future civilizations were planted. But the trauma of the flood never left them. It echoed through their stories, rituals, and architecture. Temples were built to honor the gods who spared them. Sacred mountains, rising above the floodwaters, became places of pilgrimage. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose tier by tier, perhaps echoing the layered design of Utnapishtim's great boat, a structure meant to reach the heavens in thanks. In Central America, pyramids towered above jungle canopies, some of which held secret underground chambers, perhaps reminders of the safety found below during times of chaos. In Egypt, too, the Nile's regular flooding gave rise to mythologies of death and rebirth. Osiris, drowned and resurrected, became the very soul of the land's cycles. All across the globe, people seemed to remember not just the flood itself, but the feeling of being small beneath the sky's fury. They watched the clouds more closely. They honored rivers, lakes, and seas with reverence. Water became both feared and sacred, a giver and taker of life, the great mother and the great destroyer. In time, entire calendars were built around predicting the rhythms of water. Lunar cycles were studied, equinoxes celebrated, and rain dances performed. These were not just acts of superstition, but desperate ancient conversations with the forces that had once drowned the world. And yet, in the middle of all this fear, there was also celebration, for in surviving the flood, humanity believed itself chosen, special, given a second chance. The idea that we were spared, that we are the children of the survivors, gives a sense of destiny to the human journey. We are not merely animals. We are the stewards of a reborn world. This belief finds its way into myth again and again. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim is granted immortality for his obedience. In Genesis, Noah receives a covenant, a promise sealed by a rainbow. In India, Manu is gifted the law, the seeds of Dharma, to guide mankind forward. Each story suggests that knowledge comes with survival, that enduring the flood unlocks deeper wisdom. And perhaps that is true even in a scientific sense. Catastrophes have shaped our species again and again, forcing us to adapt, to innovate, to bond together. Whether it be volcanic winters, asteroid impacts, or ice ages, each crisis we survive has made us stronger, more aware of the fragility of our place on Earth. In the story of the flood, we see this pattern most clearly. Before the flood, there is pride, noise, excess. After the flood, silence, reflection, and rebirth. It is not just the land that is cleansed, it is the human spirit. Even today, the idea of a great flood continues to capture our imagination. It appears in films, books, and art. We dream of watery apocalypses and of starting anew on distant shores or high mountains. The flood, though ancient, still lives within us, a symbol of both terror and possibility. Perhaps we are drawn to it because we feel deep within that another flood could come, not of water perhaps, but of fire, or disease, or silence. We live in an age of rising seas and shifting climates, and the stories of the past feel less like myths and more like warnings. The flood is not behind us. It is ahead, always just beyond the horizon, urging us to remember, to prepare, to change. But this story, this long and winding tale, is not just about the end. It is about what lies beyond the end. The floodwaters may rise, but so too does the human heart, buoyed by hope, by love, and by the unshakable belief that no matter how high the tide, we will find a way forward. And so, with each gentle wave, we drift toward the next chapter, toward the new world waiting to be built from the remnants of the old. Beneath the silt and stone of modern landscapes lie the bones of forgotten cities, whole worlds swallowed by the slow, relentless rise of water. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of roads leading into the sea, staircases that descend into nothingness, harbors far from any current coastline. These are not the inventions of myth. They are quiet testimonies to a time when the waters came. One such place is Dwarka, the legendary city of Krishna, said to have sunk beneath the Arabian Sea. For centuries, it was dismissed as legend, until divers discovered structures that aligned with ancient descriptions. Stone walls, grids of streets, and artifacts were found where no city should have been. While the debate continues among scholars, the implications are clear. Some stories that sound like myths may be rooted in truth. In the North Sea, known as Doggerland, vast plains once connected Britain to continental Europe. It was a place of rivers and animals, of human habitation. But as the glaciers melted, the seas advanced, slowly at first, then faster. One final, catastrophic wave, possibly a tsunami from an underwater landslide, sealed its fate. Today, all that remains are fragments dredged from the seabed, tools, bones, and pieces of forgotten lives. There is something haunting about these sunken worlds. They speak of time's erasure, the way water doesn't just flood a place, but takes its story with it. We walk the earth believing we understand its past, but beneath our feet lie entire chapters missing from our books. The flood did not only reshape the land, it reshaped memory itself. In the Andes, high above modern sea level, ancient lake beds and marine fossils rest like forgotten puzzle pieces. On mountaintops around the world, there are accounts of fish found far from any ocean. How did they get there? For ancient people, such discoveries were not anomalies. They were confirmations of what their elders had always told them. The water had been everywhere. Even here, religious texts, too, carried these memories forward. The Quran speaks of the prophet Nuh, a faithful servant chosen by God to carry life aboard a vessel, while punishment fell upon the disbelievers. The language used mirrors that found in earlier traditions, but more importantly, it preserves the core lesson. Faith, obedience, and preparation can preserve life even in the face of annihilation. In Buddhist cosmology, The universe itself is cyclical. Vast epochs rise and fall, sometimes ending in floods, sometimes in fire. Entire realms are washed clean before new ones are born. These are not isolated tales. They are part of a global human consciousness that sees flood not only as destruction, but as transition. Some have suggested that the prevalence of flood myths is due to their psychological resonance. Water is one of the earliest and most fundamental symbols in the human mind. It is our source, our sustenance, and our fear. It surrounds us in the womb, and it threatens us from the outside world. To fear the flood is to fear regression, to being overwhelmed, undone, swallowed whole. But to survive it, to emerge, soaked and shaken but alive, is a metaphor for growth. Each generation inherits not only the land, but the memory of what it took to keep it dry. The flood is a test, and survival a sacred duty. Across the Pacific, the Hawaiian chants speak of a great wave that once swept the islands, scattering people and changing the terrain forever. In Polynesian cultures, navigators memorized the stars, tides, and stories, not just to explore, but to escape, should the waters return. Their myths were maps, tools to remember and to respond. Even the most remote tribes of the Amazon have stories of floods, massive waters sent by angry spirits, or celestial events. In their telling, the animals often aid humanity, guiding, warning, or helping build rafts. The flood, then, becomes not a punishment, but a cosmic reset, a necessary washing away of pride, waste, and disharmony. This view was not lost on ancient philosophers. The Stoics believed that the universe periodically returned to a state of chaos, not out of malice, but from necessity. Destruction was simply part of the rhythm of nature. In such a view, the flood is not evil, it is balance. When the waters finally withdrew, when the clouds parted, and the sun returned, what remained was a quiet world, emptied of noise, cleared of its excesses. Trees slowly returned. Rivers found their beds. The survivors emerged not into the world they had left behind, but into something unfamiliar. The silence of the post-flood world must have been deafening, a stillness that demanded reverence. There are no great monuments from that liminal time, only stories. Stone had not yet been carved, and if it had, it was worn smooth by the waves. What survived was passed mouth to ear, guarded by the elders, woven into ritual. Songs were sung not just to entertain, but to encode memory. Dances became reenactments of escape and rebirth. In this way, the flood became eternal, always remembered, always near. The sky, once dark and thunderous, grew calm again. The wind that had howled through broken branches and bent trees had softened to a breeze, and with the stillness came an awareness. The world had changed. Survivors, dazed and quiet, stepped onto land reshaped by water's relentless will. Hills had become islands. Valleys were now lakes. What had once been familiar was now strange. In this alien landscape, they began again, guided only by memory and instinct. No maps could help them now. The stars remained the same, but the land below them had transformed. The rivers that once flowed gently had been diverted, their paths cut deep by the torrent. What little remained of the old world was soaked, scattered, and broken. Yet, in that brokenness, there was potential. The soil, newly enriched by silt, was fertile. The air, once heavy with moisture, now held a clarity unknown before. In such times, survival demanded cooperation. Small groups gathered on high ground where food was found and danger was lessened. Elders shared the old stories by firelight, and children listened with wide eyes. These tales were not told for entertainment, they were instructions for living, warnings of what once was, and could be again. Among the remnants of humanity, new roles emerged. The storyteller became a guardian of truth, the builder, a bringer of order. The hunter, once roaming vast forests, now searched in marshes and shallows, and the weaver, the one who bound reeds and fibers into something strong, became central to survival. From woven boats to shelters, everything began again with hands and memory. Religion was born anew in this post-flood world, where once people had worshipped gods of abundance and war, now they turned to deities of mercy, of preservation, of balance. The flood had proven that no force on earth could rival the sky's fury, and so temples were built higher, altars raised toward the heavens. The gods were no longer just powerful. They were just exacting and watching. And so began the long process of rebuilding. Each tree planted was an act of defiance against chaos. Each wall erected a small victory over the waters. And as generations passed, the flood stories evolved, shaped by new languages, new fears, new hopes, but their core remained unchanged. A flood had come, the world had ended, and humanity had endured. Buried beneath those stories, however, is something more primal, the fear of recurrence. It's a fear that sits quietly beneath the surface of our minds, whispering that balance is fragile, that what was once lost could be lost again. And perhaps that fear is what drove early people to seek control, to study the skies, to track the moon, to predict the rains, not because they could stop them, but because knowing meant power, even in the smallest measure. In Mesopotamia, early farmers built canals and levees, not just to water crops, but to tame rivers that had once spilled their fury across the land. In Egypt, the annual flood of the Nile was no longer feared, but celebrated, measured, ritualized, and even taxed. Civilization grew, not despite the water, but because of it. The Great Flood was not just a memory of destruction. It was the crucible in which civilization was forged. It pushed humanity to settle, to build, to observe. In remembering what had been lost, people became determined to never lose so much again. Writing was invented to track stores and seasons. Mathematics emerged to measure land and time. Architecture rose in stone, defying decay and deluge alike. But always, beneath the brick, beneath the ink, beneath the prayer, the memory of water remained. And as those memories continued to ripple through time, they began to shape origin stories, not just of places, but of people. Whole nations define themselves as descendants of the chosen few who survive. Flood myths weren't merely historical, they were foundational. A people who had survived the wrath of the gods were stronger, wiser, more righteous. The flood became a badge of divine favor, a second birth ordained by the heavens. In the Americas, the stories were rich and varied. The Inca told of a flood sent by the god Viracocha, who then repopulated the earth from the highlands. The Ojibwe spoke of a great turtle who carried survivors on his back until dry land formed once again. Each tale reinforced the sacredness of water and the delicate dance between destruction and creation. Among the Maori of New Zealand, it was not always water that destroyed, but still the theme remained. Great forces reset the world, and humans must respond with humility. In their stories, floods came not just as punishment, but as reminders. People had grown too loud, too greedy, too disconnected. The flood was not a cruelty, it was a correction. And this view was echoed in the East. In Japanese myth, the world begins in a swirling chaos of sea and mist. The land itself is formed from the tip of a spear, as water and order slowly take shape. When humans stray from harmony, the sea returns, reclaiming what was once tamed. The ocean, ever patient, waits for balance to be lost again. In this way, the flood is not a story with an end, but a circle, a cycle of rise and fall, of silence and sound. The water comes, and the water recedes. What matters is how we change in its wake. Are we wiser? Kinder? Do we remember? Or do we return, again and again, to the pride that preceded the storm? Modern science, for all its rigor, has begun to glimpse the echoes of these ancient fears. Ice cores, sediment layers, and fossilized pollen all tell stories that match what our ancestors already knew. Something profound happened as the last ice age ended. Something sudden, violent, and unforgettable. Whether it was a slow drowning or a swift surge, the world shifted, and humanity was forced to adapt or vanish. And yet, adapt we did. From the scattered survivors of the flood came great civilizations. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, all rose near rivers, near floodplains. It is as though the very trauma of water became a guide, showing us where to settle, what to watch for, how to build. The paradox of the flood is this: it was both the destroyer and the teacher. It showed us that nothing is permanent, that nature does not bend to our will, but also that we can endure, that from brokenness, beauty can rise, that even as the rain falls and the waters rise, we are not powerless. We are the children of survivors, and their courage flows in our veins like the rivers they once crossed. As the post-flood generations took root, their lives began to reflect a reverence for cycles, not only of water and season, but of history and morality. They built calendars to track the stars and rains, mapping time with precision their ancestors might have only dreamed of. And through these rhythms, the memory of the flood was encoded into ritual, not simply remembered, but relived. Each year, as rivers swelled with the coming rains, communities performed ceremonies not to stop the flood, but to ask its mercy. Offerings were made, songs were sung, and dances performed to appease the forces that had once drowned the earth. This was not fear alone, it was respect. An acknowledgement that life and death flowed from the same source. In Mesopotamia, the Akitu festival marked the new year and the symbolic reenactment of creation after chaos. Priests read ancient texts aloud, reminding the people that the gods had once destroyed the world and chosen to restore it. These ceremonies were not superstition. They were the cultural DNA of a people who had lived through and beyond the unthinkable. The Nile's annual flood was not only tracked, but worshipped as Hapi, the god of nourishment. Unlike the destructive deluge of earlier stories, Hapi's waters were welcome, because they were predictable. But even then, the edge of chaos was never far. Too much or too little water brought ruin. And so the people continued to pray, not for power over the flood, but for balance within it. And far to the east, in the Indus Valley, early urban planners constructed cities with sophisticated drainage systems and elevated platforms. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa weren't merely marvels of engineering. They were living responses to the memory of water's wrath. Streets were angled to divert floodwaters. Wells were communal. Entire societies emerged from the desire not to dominate nature, but to live beside it with care. In China, Emperor Yu the Great was remembered not for fighting the flood with brute force, but for learning to live with it. He didn't build dams, he dug channels. He redirected rather than resisted. His legend tells us that greatness is not found in conquest, but in understanding. All of this speaks to a truth that echoes quietly through the ages. The flood did not end with the receding waters. It lived on in minds, in customs, in the architecture of early civilization. The memory became the foundation. And in that way, the flood became not only a tragedy, but a teacher. There is humility in the flood story. It reminds us of our place in the world, not above nature, but within it. The survivors who rebuilt did so not because they were stronger, but because they remembered what it felt like to lose everything. That memory made them cautious, but also wise. And as the centuries passed, the flood story moved from generation to generation. It crossed oceans, climbed mountains, and crept into every corner of the earth. Each culture gave it new names, new symbols, new meanings, but the core remained. A cleansing, a beginning, a second chance. That shared memory, scattered yet unified, may be the closest thing humanity has to a universal myth. It binds us across language and lineage. It tells us we are not the first to face devastation, and we will not be the last. But it also tells us that after the waters come, there is always land. After the loss, there is always life. From the softened clay of riverbanks, the first bricks were shaped. With hands still calloused from survival, early humans began to raise walls. Temples rose where waters once surged. Cities emerged on foundations made not of stone alone, but of memory. The flood had taught humanity its most crucial lesson. Permanence is an illusion. And yet, even knowing this, we built anyway. Perhaps it was defiance, or perhaps it was hope, a hope that what we build might outlast the next storm, that our children might inherit more than ruins and stories. In that spirit, ancient builders carved their lessons into stone, not trusting paper or bark. They wanted the story to last. The earliest flood myths, inscribed in cuneiform tablets, speak in tones both reverent and resigned. The gods bring the flood not merely out of rage, but out of necessity. Humanity had grown too loud, too wild. The flood, in those lines, is not a punishment. It is a reset, a chance for the world to breathe again. In this narrative, humans are not the center, but part of a much larger, more delicate balance. Nature is not an enemy to be tamed, but a force to be respected. These ideas found their way into the very bones of early law. The Code of Hammurabi, the teachings of Confucius, the wisdom of tribal elders across continents, all carried the faint echo of the flood's lesson. Live in harmony, or pay the price. As humanity spread, we took the flood story with us, across deserts, over mountains, into forests and islands. The tale adapted. In each new environment, the flood took on the traits of the land, but the soul remained. Whether as a rain of blood, a wall of ice, or a wave of silence, the message was unchanged. Nothing lasts unless it is remembered. And remember we did, in petroglyphs, in chants, in cave paintings. The flood became part of our identity. It became more than a story. It became a mirror, a way for each generation to reflect on its choices. Are we living well? Are we balanced? Or are we repeating the same mistakes that once brought the waters down? Somewhere deep in the human mind, there remains a quiet unease, the sense that the flood is never truly gone. It's part of the rhythm of things. Just as night follows day, just as winter follows fall, the flood waits. It watches. And when the world becomes too heavy, too full, too loud, it returns. And yet, this is not a reason for fear. It is a call for mindfulness. The flood, in its deepest sense, is a teacher. It reminds us that every civilization, no matter how grand, is built on borrowed time. That every skyscraper, every monument, every map is temporary. What remains, what always remains, is the story. Somewhere along the banks of a now vanished river, a child once listened as an elder spoke of the flood, of how the mountains disappeared beneath black skies, and of how the animals cried before the waters came. That child grew up with the memory not of the event, but of the story, and in turn passed it down. In this way, the flood lived on through generations not as terror, but as truth, a cornerstone of understanding, a quiet undercurrent in the river of time. Across the world, this pattern repeated. In places where no written word existed, the flood was woven into oral traditions. The storyteller became the keeper of survival, their voice carrying not entertainment, but inheritance. The words, though shaped by different tongues, all flowed from the same source. The rain came, the world changed, and humanity was given one more chance. In these stories, it is not power or strength that ensures survival. It is humility. The hero of the flood is rarely a warrior. More often, it is a farmer, a fisherman, a quiet figure who listens, the one who hears the warning, who prepares, who builds. And in that message, there is a subtle encouragement, not to seek dominance over nature, but to live attentively within it. Ancient boats, long since turned to dust, once bobbed over drowned lands. They carried more than life. They carried continuity, seeds for planting, scrolls of forgotten languages, tools crafted with care. The ark, in whatever form it took, was not only a vessel, it was a library, a temple, a bridge from what was to what could be. In many traditions, animals enter the boat not just as cargo, but as companions. They are part of the renewal. Their presence reminds us that humanity is not alone. We are threads in a wider tapestry. When the flood ends and the boat comes to rest, the world is not repopulated by people alone, but by all the creatures that breathe and move and feel. This sacred companionship is reflected in tribal customs, where animals are seen not as resources, but as kin. High in the Andes, jaguars and condors are said to have guided the first people to safety. In the Arctic, whales and bears play roles in survival tales. These are not fictions to those who tell them. They are truth, encoded in symbol. The flood reminds us that we are part of a shared world. What affects one, affects all. Over time, the memory of the flood shaped the architecture of civilization itself. Cities were built with escape routes. Sacred mountains were venerated not just for their height, but for their role as havens when the sea rose. Floodplains were avoided or ritualized. Even today, ancient ruins often sit on high ground, not merely by chance, but by wisdom. As agriculture spread, irrigation became both a blessing and a warning. Water, properly guided, brought life. Left untamed, it brought ruin. Ancient engineers learned from the stories. Their aqueducts, canals, and terraces were not just marvels of design, they were prayers in stone. And through it all, the story remained, carved into temple walls, painted onto pots, woven into fabrics. The flood was never far. It lived in lullabies, in rites of passage, in the turning of the seasons. When the rains began to fall heavy, people still watched the skies with quiet reverence. Somewhere in every culture, a word remained for the day when the water might rise again. Not all floods were global, but all were personal. For a village by the river, a single night of rising water could be the end of a world. And so, even local disasters became tied into the greater myth. The flood was not just one event long ago, it was a pattern, a presence, a reminder that stability is a gift, not a guarantee. In the heart of Africa, the Dogon people speak of ancestral waters that once covered everything. Their stories tell of great fish who helped people float to safety, and of hills that rose like islands to shelter those in need. Their flood is spiritual as well as physical, a cleansing of not just land, but of thought. In Southeast Asia, entire villages were constructed on stilts, not only for practicality, but as a quiet acknowledgement of nature's unpredictability. Floating markets, boathouses, and amphibious farming methods are not modern innovations. They are echoes of ancient adaptations. The flood shaped not only myth, but method. The flood also reshaped how people viewed time. In many early calendars, the year begins with the flood season. In Egypt, the first month followed the inundation of the Nile. In the Mayan system, great cycles ended with water. Time itself became tied to the rhythm of rain, a reflection of beginnings born from ends. As the flood stories migrated into religious texts, their meanings deepened. The waters were no longer just punishment or cleansing. They became part of a divine dialogue. God speaks through storm and silence alike. The rainbow, after the rain, becomes not just a promise, but a pact, a reminder that destruction is never the final word. And yet, despite their sacredness, flood stories remain profoundly human. They speak of fear, of confusion, of survival in darkness. They speak of huddling in cramped spaces, of listening to the groan of timbers in wind and wave, of waiting for a world to return. They speak of the first moment, after the storm, when one dares to hope again. In many traditions, it is a bird that signals the end. A dove, a raven, a small creature flying toward the unknown. These birds are not just messengers. They are the first explorers of a new earth. Their flight is both practical and poetic. They carry the question we all carry. Has the storm passed? Is it safe now? That moment, the return of the bird, the leaf in its beak, the glimpse of dry land, is the heart of every flood story. Not the destruction, but the discovery. That something survived, that life goes on, that the end was not the end after all. And so, while the flood marks the loss of the old, it also marks the birth of the new. What is rebuilt after the waters go down is never exactly the same, but it is stronger, more mindful. It bears the mark of those who remember. After the waters receded and the winds fell still, survivors stepped onto unfamiliar ground. It was the same earth, yet not the one they had known. Trees had been uprooted, their twisted trunks now drifting monuments. Animals wandered, displaced, their patterns of life disrupted. Silence hung heavy over the land. Not the peace of calm, but the hush of shock. The flood had rewritten the landscape and the mind alike. They began by naming what was left. Stones became markers of survival. The hill where they waited out the storm. The tree that held fast. The river that changed course. In naming, they reclaimed the land. They made it theirs again, not with force, but with story. And through those names, the memory of the flood was anchored in space. The first structures were not grand. They were shelters, crude and temporary. But with each generation, the building changed. From reed mats to clay bricks, from wood beams to carved stone. The desire to last to outlive the next flood was, in every corner laid, every beam raised. In this way, architecture became a kind of defiance, a statement that life would not be washed away so easily again. In the Americas, mound builders raised sacred spaces above the floodplains. These were not just temples, they were platforms of preservation. In Asia, step terraces followed the contours of mountains, not only to farm, but to resist erosion. In Europe, early dwellings appeared on stilts beside lakes, forming communities that hovered just above the water's edge. Each method, unique yet similar, born from the same origin. Memory of the flood. The human urge to record, to remember, began to take more lasting form. Clay tablets, etched with styluses, bore words of warning and wisdom. On cave walls, spirals and waves echoed the flood's presence. Myth gave structure to memory, and memory gave birth to identity. To be a people meant to remember, not just who they were, but what they had endured. Many of these early writings emphasized balance. The Sumerians wrote of maintaining mytho-divine laws that ordered society and cosmos. The Egyptians emphasized Ma'at, the harmony that kept the world from slipping back into chaos. Flood stories weren't just about nature. They were about the thin line between order and disorder, both in the world and within the self. Children grew up learning not just the words of the story, but the feeling of it, the tension before the storm, the fear as waters rose, the hope as birds flew. It wasn't merely taught, it was felt, embodied in dances, rituals, and seasonal ceremonies. Every drop of rain was a reminder, every river crossing a quiet reckoning. Some traditions held that the flood had been sent not only to destroy, but to cleanse the soul of the world. Human pride, disconnection, and forgetfulness had brought it forth. In this view, the flood is a reset not just of land, but of spirit, and those who survived carried the burden and the blessing of starting again with clearer eyes. With time, the stories became layered with symbolism. The ark became the womb, carrying life through chaos. The mountain, a place of refuge, became the axis between heaven and earth. The rain, though once terrifying, came to represent renewal. And so the story grew, not only in size, but in depth. It became a lens through which the world was understood. In the centuries that followed, the flood story was not forgotten. It lived on through empires, through migrations, through the slow and steady march of time. Wherever humans went, they brought it with them, sometimes in full, sometimes in fragments, but always present. The flood was like a watermark on the soul of humanity, faint but unmistakable. The Judeo-Christian tradition carried the story through millennia, woven into the fabric of spiritual understanding. Noah's Ark became a symbol of faith, obedience, and survival. It stood as proof that the righteous could endure even the worst storms. Churches, stained glass windows, and sacred texts all preserved the image. A man, a boat, a world washed clean. Islam carried the flood through the story of Nuh, who, like Noah, warned his people and prepared the vessel that would carry life forward. His story emphasizes patience, trust in divine wisdom, and the pain of watching those who refuse to listen. The ark, again, is salvation, but only for those who heed the signs. In Hinduism, the flood appears in the form of Manu's tale. Saved by a Fishan avatar of Vishnu, builds a boat and survives the deluge. But in this telling, the fish not only warns but guides. The divine is not distant, but involved. The flood, though vast, is part of a larger cosmic cycle, and those who endure it are charged with responsibility. This sense of duty is a thread that runs through many versions. Survival is not a reward, it is a calling. Those who live must carry forward more than themselves. They must plant the seeds, retell the stories, and protect what remains. In this way, the flood is not the end, but the beginning of stewardship. Artists and philosophers found inspiration in these stories. The flood was painted as both horror and hope, a sublime vision of nature's fury and man's endurance. Writers used it as metaphor for personal loss, for emotional overwhelm, for spiritual awakening. The waters that drown are the same waters that baptize. Modern psychology has found resonance in the image of the flood. It is the unconscious mind, the wave of emotion, the suppressed memory. To face the flood is to confront what lies beneath, and to survive it is to emerge, changed, purged of illusion, closer to truth. As history unfolded, real floods continued to shape human experience. From the Yellow River's wild course to the Mississippi's unpredictable tides, from tsunamis to storm surges, the water never truly left. Each disaster rekindled the old stories. Each rebuilding reaffirmed the ancient lesson. Life is fragile. Community is strength. Memory is salvation. Even in times of peace and plenty, the flood remains in our minds. It appears in dreams, in fears of loss, in the quiet moments when we wonder what we would save if the waters came tonight. It is not obsession. It is vigilance, born of ancestry. We remember because forgetting would leave us vulnerable. The flood is not behind us. It is part of us. And as we build our cities and craft our futures, we do so with the knowledge excellent but ever present that water, patient and powerful, waits. In every age, the flood returns. Not always in water, but in form. It may come as war, famine, disease, or silence, a sweeping force that reshapes life as we know it. And when it comes, the old stories stir again. We hear their rhythm in the way people gather, adapt, and rebuild. In this way, the flood is not bound by time. It is a truth that repeats. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept through continents like a wave, taking lives, collapsing systems, redrawing the human map. To those who lived through it, it felt like a flood of death. The same questions echoed. Why now? Why us? What survives when all else is gone? And, as in the old stories, it was not the strongest who endured, but the ones who listened, who changed, who cared. Centuries later, floods would return in literal form. In China's Yellow River Basin, repeated catastrophes took millions of lives. In Bangladesh, monsoon rains remind the people that balance is delicate. And in recent times, as seas rise and coasts erode, the question becomes louder. Are we listening again? The ancient flood stories were not warnings alone, they were blueprints. They show us how to act when the waters rise. Help one another, carry the essentials, protect the stories, trust what endures. Rebuild with memory, not denial. And above all, understand that the flood doesn't come to punish it, comes to remind. The ark, in every telling, is not just transport, it is sanctuary. It is not made of metal or pride, but of wisdom and love. It holds the best of us, our families, our kindness, our learning. In modern terms, the ark can be community, knowledge, or compassion, that which floats when the world sinks. In times of peace, we often forget to maintain our ark. We forget the stories, let the seeds dry out, lose touch with the sky. But the flood stories endure to nudge us back. They tell us, build now, prepare in the calm, for it is not during the storm that the ark is built, it is before. From ancient highlands to modern cities, this message pulses. In climate studies, urban planning, and environmental treaties, we see the echo. The flood shaped us. And so, when we try to shape our world today, we do so beneath that memory. Even our warnings carry its tone. Rising seas, melting ice, shifting skies. It's all a language our ancestors would recognize. And if they could speak to us across the gap of time, perhaps they would say, it happened once. It will happen again. But you are not alone. You come from those who endured. You carry their wisdom in your veins, their story in your breath. Listen to the earth. Tend to each other. The flood teaches, but it also tests. We are always being tested. In our values, our compassion, our choices. The flood is never only water. It is everything that overwhelms us. But within it is the potential for clarity. When the noise is drowned out, what remains? That is what the flood reveals. The quiet after the storm carries a weight unlike any other. It is not peace, but a kind of sacred silence, a stillness so complete, it feels as though the world is holding its breath. Survivors of real floods often speak of this, of emerging from shelters, of looking over still waters, reflecting broken rooftops and leafless trees, of the sound of nothing and everything at once. In those moments, something ancient awakens, a recognition that this has happened before, that others once stood at the edge of their world and asked, what now? In the earliest myths, this moment is pivotal, the moment when the ark comes to rest, when the clouds break, when a bird returns, that one instant when hope dares to show its face again. And with it comes the question, how do we begin again? Beginning again is never simple. It requires humility, patience, and vision. It demands that we remember what brought the flood and what allowed us to survive. And more than that, it requires faith. Not always in gods or fate, but in each other. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim offers a lesson not in defiance, but in acceptance. He does not rage against the gods for the flood, they are part of the order. He survives because he listens. And afterward, he lives quietly, away from the world. His gift is not power, but perspective. Perspective is perhaps the greatest gift the flood gives. When all is stripped away, what matters most becomes clear. The soil matters. Water matters. Fire, warmth, kinship, food. The basics of life, often ignored in times of plenty, become sacred again. And the stories become our compass. That's why flood myths were never merely entertainment. They were teaching tools, encoded instructions for survival, not just physical, but moral. They showed how arrogance leads to collapse, how noise and excess blind us to warning signs, how nature cannot be controlled, only respected. But they also taught that after the end, something new is always possible. Not a return to what was, but the creation of something wiser. A culture rooted in memory. A people who carry their story not as burden, but as guide. Some modern thinkers believe the flood story is encoded in our DNA, that its shape mirrors our deepest fears and hopes, destruction and rebirth, chaos and order, loss and rediscovery, that we are drawn to it not only because it is ancient, but because it is true metaphorically, and perhaps even historically. Whether we face personal flood-soft grief, illness, failure, collective one-soft disaster, division, or change, the story remains relevant. The ark must still be built. The essentials must still be carried. The bird must still be released. And when we step out again onto a world made new by trial, we carry more than ourselves. We carry the memory of those who once did the same. In the layers of earth that hold the memory of ages, there are signs of floods that shape not only terrain but destiny. Sediment abruptly interrupted by sand, clay crushed beneath smooth stones, fossilized remains of forests in places where no trees grow now. The land itself remembers what we often forget. Geologists find evidence of sudden, immense flooding events in every corner of the globe. The scablands of North America, carved by glacial meltwater, so sudden and vast, it rearranged entire landscapes. The Black Sea's deep basin, once a freshwater lake, now salt-filled and vastly expanded, perhaps the source of many Mediterranean flood myths. And in South America, the paths of ancient rivers suggest rerouted lives, communities lost to the tides of change. These are not coincidences. They are echoes of the same truth. Water is both giver and taker. The earliest humans settled near water for its life-giving gifts. But they paid the price when that same water turned wild. And so the flood lives in our bones, in our habits, in our most sacred spaces. Even our dreams carry its shape. Psychologists have long noted how dreams of floods often arise during times of emotional overwhelm. Water rushing in where it shouldn't, sweeping away the known, leaving only uncertainty. But in those dreams, too, there is often a raft, a door, a shore. We carry the image of survival as deeply as the fear of drowning. The flood myth, for all its terror, is not a story of finality. It is a story of endurance, of becoming. When the rain ends and the waters recede, something is born. Not merely the same world again, but a new one. One informed by loss, softened by memory. And in that new world, survivors are never alone. Across every culture's mythos, those who live through the flood do not simply resume life, they reshape it. They set down new laws, inspired by the fragility of what was lost. They plant new trees, not just for food, but for remembrance. They raise children with stories that begin before the water came. Those stories are how humanity built meaning from devastation. They are how we passed down what mattered most when all else was taken. They remind us that survival without memory is not enough. We must remember not only how we lived, but how we almost didn't. Every culture has its threshold, its sacred line drawn in water. In Japan, it is the tsunami stone-large boulders, etched with warnings from ancestors, placed high above the shore. Do not build below this point. In the Pacific Islands, legends tell of great waves that once swallowed entire islands, urging the people to listen to the ocean's voice. In Iceland, lava fields and glacial rivers mark the line between fire and water, a landscape shaped by both, respected as both creator and destroyer. Even now, our cities and civilizations press dangerously close to water's edge. Skyscrapers reflect in rivers, ports hum with life, and levees hold back the sea with concrete fingers. But still, the memory lingers. In policies, in architecture, in emergency drills, the story of the flood is told without words. It shapes our choices, whether we know it or not. The ark may look different now, but the idea remains. What do we save when we can't save everything? What is essential? What floats? In the quiet that follows each telling of the flood story, a question always arises. Why did it happen? And, perhaps more importantly, could it happen again? The answers across time have shifted. For some, the flood came as divine judgment. For others, it was nature's rhythm. Still others saw it as accident, the result of forces beyond comprehension or control. In truth, the flood is all of these things. It is punishment and renewal, chaos and order, beginning and end. That's what gives it its staying power. It adapts with each generation, reflecting our fears, our values, our relationship with the unknown. And yet, despite the differences in telling, the emotional thread is consistent. The flood forces separation. It tears people from homes, children from parents, towns from trade routes. It isolates. And in that isolation, it asks, what are you without what you had? Who are you when the world is stripped bare? The survivors, in every story, find out, sometimes painfully, sometimes with grace, but always, they emerge changed. The waters may recede, but they leave behind a new landscape, both outside and within. That is why the flood is more than a myth. It is a mirror. It shows us what we have built our lives upon, and asks if it will float. It reveals the fragility of empire, of ego, of anything not rooted in care. And then it leaves us with a chance to build again differently. This message feels as urgent now as it did in the time of the earliest flood stories. As the climate warms and waters rise, we are again faced with questions of preparation, of humility, of stewardship. We are writing our own flood story in real time, though perhaps without realizing it. But just like those who came before, we have a choice. We can ignore the signs, or we can build our ark not of wood and pitch, but of cooperation, memory, and vision. We can gather what matters, our stories, our seeds, our values. We can prepare not just to survive, but to emerge wiser. And if the water comes again, whether slowly or suddenly, we will know, somewhere deep within, that we have seen this story before, that we come from those who survived, that we too carry the power to rebuild. Because the flood, though powerful, is never the final word. In the ancient world, the flood was remembered not just in words, but in orientation. Cities designed in relation to rivers, temples aligned with solstices and tides, entire societies shaped by the rise and fall of water. Even without clocks or satellites, early people knew the rhythms of the earth. They watched the sky, listened to the land, and read the rivers like scripture. This knowledge was passed on with quiet reverence. In Mesopotamia, priests observed the Euphrates and Tigris with ritual attention. In Egypt, the Nile's moods were tracked with a nilometeran instrument built to measure the water's rise and foretell the bounty or famine to come. In China, the Yellow River was both revered and feared, called China's sorrow for its unpredictable fury. Floods taught precision. They demanded awareness, and those who ignored the signs paid dearly. Thus, the flood story was not only a memory, it was a tool, a guide, a set of instructions written in myth but understood as law. Live close to water, but not too close. Work with it, not against it. Respect the balance, and it may spare you. But these teachings were never rigid. They evolved. And in their evolution, we see humanity's creativity. In the Netherlands, entire communities learned to live below sea level by building dikes and polders. In Cambodia, floating villages rise and fall with the waters of the Tonle Sap. In the Amazon, raised houses and shifting routes revealed generations of flood knowledge. These were not people afraid of the water, they were people who understood it, who knew that flood was not enemy, but teacher, a force to be watched, to be felt, to be partnered with, not conquered. Modern civilization, in its rush to grow, often forgets this balance. Rivers are straightened, wetlands are drained, coastlines are expanded, and yet the water remembers its path. Eventually, it returns, it rises, and when it does, the old stories feel less like myths and more like memories knocking on the door. Flood myths remind us not to be surprised. They tell us this has happened before, and it will happen again. The question is not whether the water will rise, but whether we are listening, whether we have honored the lessons, whether our foundations are made of stone or sand. And those lessons extend beyond nature. The flood story also teaches of emotional and spiritual inundation, of times when grief, fear, or loss overwhelms the individual like a tide. In these moments, too, the ark must be built, the essentials gathered, the inner voice listened to. This is why the flood appears in all forms of art and expression. It is not just about survival, it is about remembering who we are when all else is washed away. It is about finding the still point in the storm and emerging, changed but whole. In the rebuilding after the flood, something remarkable always occurs: a reevaluation. Survivors do not simply reconstruct what was, they reconsider what should be. With the old world washed away, there is room to dream differently, to rebuild not in the image of the past, but in the hope of a better future. And so, flood myths are often accompanied by origin stories not just of humanity, but of law, language, and culture. In Sumerian lore, kingship descends from the heavens after the flood. In the Torah, a covenant is formed, marking the beginning of divine law. In Hindu texts, Manu receives teachings that lay the foundation for Dharma. In each case, the flood is not the final note, is the prelude to order, to clarity. The chaos of water gives way to structure, but this structure is meaningful only if rooted in memory. Forgetting the flood leads to repetition. Remembering it leads to wisdom. This is reflected in the rituals of remembrance, in the annual readings, reenactments, and commemorations, in how cultures build high and mark floodlines with sacred symbols, in how we still use terms like deluge to describe overwhelming events. The language lives on because the lesson does. There is also a deeply human tenderness in these stories. The flood brings out the fragility of life and also its resilience. Parents sheltering children, strangers helping one another float. The act of reaching out when waters rise is universal. It is a truth older than any text. That's why flood stories are often the heart of sacred scriptures. They speak not just to divine justice, but to human unity. In the ark, every being has value. Every species has a place. The boat is not a fortress, it is a sanctuary, made sacred not by its shape, but by its purpose. The materials used to build the ark vary across stories: gopher, wood, cypress, sacred fig. But what matters more is the intention behind them. The ark is never built quickly. It is crafted with care, with attention, with devotion. This slow building, often mocked by outsiders in the myths, becomes the very act that saves the world. There is a message in that too, that preparation born of faith is not foolishness, it is wisdom in motion, that the quiet work done before the storm is what carries us through it. And that belief, when rooted in awareness, becomes more than hope, it becomes action. In a time when storms both literal and symbolic gather on every horizon, the flood stories call to us once again. They do not ask us to be afraid. They ask us to remember, to prepare, and to hold tightly to what floats, not just in water, but in spirit. There are moments in the flood story's quiet, almost hidden, where time itself seems to pause. The rain has stopped. The storm has passed, but the ark still floats. No land yet in sight. No bird returned with news, just endless water and silence. These moments speak to something deep in the human heart. The waiting, the in-between, the uncertainty of not knowing what comes next. It is in this pause that faith is truly tested, not during the flood, not after, but in the long drifting that follows. When the noise has ended and the world is still, that is when doubt creeps in. Are we truly saved? Will we find ground again? Have we been forgotten? These questions echo through time. Survivors of modern disasters know this feeling. After the sirens fall quiet, after the news crews leave, after the water retreats, the silence returns. And in that stillness, one must begin again, even when direction is unclear. That is the heart of endurance, to continue without certainty. In the ancient texts, this liminal space is given great respect. It is not rushed. Days pass, weeks even. The ark does not magically land. The heroes do not leap forward. They wait. They observe. They send birds' messengers into the unknown. And when a branch is brought back, or the sky clears fully, they act, but not before. This patience is sacred. It teaches that not all answers come quickly, that renewal cannot be forced, that healing, after any flood, takes time, and that part of survival is knowing when to rest, when to drift, and when to move forward. In this way, the flood is also about rhythm, listening to the natural flow, trusting that the tides will guide us to the shore eventually. And when land is finally seen, it is not met with celebration alone. There is reverence, gratitude. The ground is kissed. Offerings are made. The survivors do not rush to reclaim the old, they mark the new with ritual. They plant not just crops, but intentions. They vow to live differently, to remember. Often the first thing built after the flood is not a house, but an altar, a place to speak to the divine, to acknowledge the forces beyond control. This is deeply human, to seek connection after chaos, to re-anchor oneself in meaning. And in doing so, the survivors reclaim more than land. They reclaim purpose. This is why flood stories have endured through millennia. They are not simply tales of destruction. They are guides through uncertainty. They tell us that even when all is lost, something remains. Even when we drift, we are not abandoned. And even when we forget, the earth remembers. As the survivors step out onto dry land, they do so barefoot, cautious. The earth feels different, soft, renewed, but unfamiliar. It is both a beginning and an ending. The old world lies behind them, buried under silt and silence. Before them, an untouched canvas stretches out waiting to be shaped. And yet, they do not rush. Their first acts are deliberate. They release the animals not into cages or fields, but into freedom. The companions of the ark, who endured the storm alongside them, are given back to the world. This is not just a gesture, it is a lesson that what was carried must also be shared. Next comes the planting. Seeds that survived in bundles of cloth or clay are placed into soil still damp from the waters. These are not just crops, they are hope made visible. The act of planting is sacred. It says, "We believe in tomorrow. We believe something can grow here again." And in this act, the flood story transforms into a creation myth. The destruction has cleared space for new life. The waters did not only erase, they prepared. The land is fresh, fertile, receptive. But it must be treated with care, for those who forget the flood are always at risk of inviting it back. This is where the first laws emerge. Simple at first, born from necessity. Share the water. Do not hoard. Protect the young. Respect the land. These principles, passed from elder to child, become tradition. Tradition becomes code. Code becomes law. And so, society is reborn, not in conquest, but in remembrance. The leaders in these early stories are not always kings or warriors. Often, they are chosen because of their memory. The one who remembers the flood most clearly is the one trusted to prevent its return. Wisdom becomes more valuable than strength. Humility becomes power. It is in this atmosphere that writing is born, not just to count goods or track seasons, but to preserve memory, to say this happened, to carve into stone or clay what once lived only in breath and firelight. The flood becomes one of the first subjects of human literature, because it is one of the first truths we knew. And so, even today, we find traces of it in our words. The language of deluge, of washing away, of new beginnings. We say a flood of emotion, a wave of change, starting with a clean slate. These phrases are not new. They are ancient echoes, fragments of a story told by fire thousands of years ago. We do not escape the flood by forgetting it. We carry it forward. In our myths, our minds, our architecture, we build levees and dams, yes, but we also build compassion, patience, memory. The real ark is not wood, it is the human heart, capable of holding sorrow and joy, loss and renewal. And so we build again, not because we must, but because we can. Because the flood did not end us, it shaped us. As the generations passed, the flood faded from living memory, but not from the soul of humanity. It became the background hum behind every ritual, the unspoken context of every myth. It no longer needed to be explained, it simply was a shared understanding, a deep imprint beneath layers of time. Children grew up hearing stories of the great water, not as bedtime tales, but as lessons folded into daily life. Why we build our homes a certain way, why the river is offered respect, why we plant by the moon and harvest with the stars. These weren't customs born from whim, They were inherited wisdom, a coded language passed down through action. And in that language, one word always remained: sacred balance. Because it wasn't only pride that brought the flood in so many of the stories, it was imbalance between people and nature, between desire and duty, between noise and silence. The flood comes when the scales tip too far, and so the survivors sought balance in all things, knowing that the cost of excess could be everything. This principle found form in architecture. Ancient temples and cities were often aligned with the sun, the stars, the seasons, not just for beauty, but for balance. The Maya built cities where water was channeled precisely, reflecting the sky in underground reservoirs. In Angkor, Cambodia, massive reservoirs and canals moved water like veins, keeping the land in harmony. Even in desert cultures, water remained central, not because it was abundant, but because it was precious. The Nabateans carved water channels through sandstone. The Berbers honored wells with songs. In these acts was a silent dialogue, not just with the earth, but with memory. The memory of when there was too much, of when control was lost. Art, too, carried the flood. Paintings showed waves sweeping across villages, angels steering boats through rain. Tapestries, murals, carvings in wood and stone all retold the moment the world was washed clean. But always, beneath the waves, there was light, a sun breaking through clouds, a mountaintop reappearing. The stories never ended in drowning, they ended in dawn. This narrative arc shaped literature and religion alike. The pattern of fall and rise, of cleansing and renewal, became the foundation of countless teachings. Baptism in Christianity, for example, draws directly from the flood, a symbolic death by water, followed by rebirth into new life. In this way, the ancient memory continues to whisper through sacred ritual. It also influenced the idea of justice. Just as the flood cleansed the earth of corruption, laws were meant to cleanse the community. Fairness became a divine mandate. The flood was no longer just a warning, it was a teacher. And the lesson was carried forward in every courtroom, every council, every oath. But even the clearest story can be forgotten if not retold. And so, in the quiet spaces of the world, storytellers kept the flood alive. Around campfires, in village squares, in the long shadows of temples, their voices, rising and falling like waves, carried the memory forward. Not all listeners believed every detail. Some questioned, doubted, reshaped, but even then, they carried the story onward, changed, perhaps, but still alive. That is the nature of myth. It adapts, flowing like the water it remembers. And in doing so, it survives. In some tellings, the flood was global. In others, it was a valley, a coast, a forest. But the emotion was the same. The awe, the fear, the relief, the renewal. It didn't matter whether it happened everywhere or just in one place, because its truth was not about geography. It was about experience. As humanity evolved, so did the flood's meaning. In modern times, it became metaphor. We speak of information floods of refugees, of noise, of sensation. The idea remains potent because it reflects a deep understanding. We are vulnerable to overwhelming forces, but we are also resilient. In psychology, flood imagery often appears in moments of breakthrough. Dreams of drowning may precede transformation. Overwhelm may signal a necessary release. Just as the earth cannot hold endless rain without change, neither can the human soul. The flood, in this sense, becomes internal, a washing away of the false, a return to clarity. This is why the story remains powerful, even when stripped of religion or history. It speaks to the universal human experience of collapse and recovery, of losing everything and starting again. Whether through grief, failure, illness, or awakening, we all experience floods, and in doing so, we remember. We remember the ark, the vessel we build in our hearts to carry what matters. We remember the dove, the sign of peace, of safe return. We remember the mountain, the place where dry land appears after long uncertainty. These symbols remain within us, ready to be called upon when the waters rise again. And the waters always rise. Slowly, quietly, or with sudden fury they come. And when they do, the stories become more than memory. They become instruction. And those who listened are those who endure. As the world today faces rising tides, both literal and symbolic, the old stories hum louder. We see ancient flood zones awakening. We see storms reshaping coasts, rivers defying maps. And beneath it all, the story continues not as prophecy, but as pattern, one we've seen before, one we can survive again. In certain moments throughout history, the flood story was nearly forgotten, not because it lacked power, but because people believed they had moved beyond it. Great cities rose in defiance of nature. Rivers were dammed, oceans crossed, and mountains tunneled through. Humanity, it seemed, had mastered the earth. The flood had become a fairy tale, quaint, symbolic, distant. But nature does not forget, and the waters, ever patient, reminded us again. In the 20th and 21st centuries, floods struck with increasing frequency and force. Deltas became danger zones. Coastlines receded. Islands vanished. And with each storm surge, the ancient memory stirred. We began to remember, not just through history books or religious texts, but through experience. New arcs emerged not made of wood, but of steel and concrete. Shelters, evacuation plans, emergency kits. Cities learned to bend rather than break. Seawalls were raised. Wetlands, once drained, were restored. Slowly, memory became action again. And yet, the deeper message of the flood still waited. Not just the call to prepare materially, but spiritually. To reflect, to simplify, to ask, what are we carrying? What are we clinging to that will not float? What have we forgotten that we must remember? Ancient flood stories often speak of forgetting, of people so consumed with growth and noise that they stopped hearing the earth's voice. They stopped listening to the wind, to the rivers, to the quiet shifts beneath their feet. And it was in this forgetting that the flood found its way back in. So the call now is not simply to survive, but to listen, to hear the stories again, not with nostalgia, but with urgency, to understand that the myths are not outdated. They are coded wisdom. They are blueprints for resilience. In our age, we have more knowledge than ever. We can predict storms, model tides, simulate outcomes, but data alone is not enough. Without memory, without story, we are clever but blind. The ancients watched the sky with reverence. We must do the same not with fear, but with attention, with respect. And as we build our new arcs, technological, cultural, emotional, we must ask, what are we saving? Are we carrying only ourselves? Or are we making space for others, for animals, for beauty, for silence? Because the flood is not only a test of strength, it is a test of values. It asks not how we survive, but why, and what we will become on the other side. What emerges from the flood is never what entered it. The world that comes after is not a return, it is a transformation. Trees grow differently. Rivers find new paths. People speak with new weight in their voices. There is grief, yes, but also clarity, a sharpening of purpose, a knowing that life is not to be wasted. In this way, the flood is a kind of purification, not in the sense of punishment, but of shedding. It strips away what cannot endure. It reveals what matters. And though the process is painful, what is left is something real, something worthy. This is why so many flood stories include themes of enlightenment, of the flood bearer receiving vision, of the survivors becoming teachers, sages, healers. Having faced the deep, they now understand the surface more completely. They do not just live, they guide. In Native American traditions, the survivors of the Great Flood become the ancestors of the tribes. In Hindu texts, Manu is not just saved, he is entrusted with the future of humanity. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim, having survived, is gifted immortality not as reward, but as remembrance, so the story will not be lost. This pattern reminds us that survival alone is not the end. It is the beginning of responsibility. The survivor becomes the storyteller. The burden of knowledge is passed down, and with it, the hope that next time, warning will be heeded. Because the flood story always offers warning, a chance. In nearly every version, someone is told ahead of time, a whisper, a dream, a sign in the stars. And it is not power that allows them to act, it is trust, faith, willingness to listen when others laugh. The ark builder, the seed saver, the quiet one in the corner, they are the true heroes. Their strength is subtle, their actions are slow, but they endure. And in their endurance, the story continues. So when we face our own floods, literal or metaphorical, we can look to them. We can build our own arks, prepare our own seeds, gather what matters. We can choose not just to survive, but to remember, to live in such a way that the story remains whole. And perhaps, if we listen closely enough, we'll hear the same whisper that spoke to the ancients, the voice that says, "The waters are rising, but you are not alone. You were never alone." The flood, though ancient, remains alive in the present, not just in oceans and storms, but in how we live, how we remember, how we prepare. It lingers in architecture, in the way we place our homes on higher ground. It whispers through the design of bridges, the width of drainage channels, the curve of canals. Even in the way we speak of things being overwhelming, we echo the waters. In every culture that has ever touched water, there is a reverence, a quiet respect that sits just below the surface. Rivers are not simply named, they are honored. Oceans are not just borders, they are ancestors. This reverence is not poetic, but practical. It is the memory of the flood made visible. In the Pacific Islands, where land meets sea in the most delicate of balances, oral traditions tell of the time when the sea came too far. Entire islands submerged, names lost, maps redrawn. The people remember not through dates or devices, but through chance, through navigation passed by stars and waves. To forget is to drown. In the Arctic, where ice is as crucial as stone, elders speak of the melt. The ground softens. The water trickles from ancient snow. It is not rain that threatens here, but time itself, releasing what was frozen. And yet, the pattern is the same. Too much, too fast, and the balance tips. And in cities of glass and steel, thousands of miles from these ancient coasts, the signs are there too. The storms come stronger, the drains struggle, the seas creep upward. People watch weather reports with a sense that was once religious. Anticipation, anxiety, hope. We live today in what some call the Anthropocene, new epoch, where human activity shapes the climate, the landscape, the very sky. But in doing so, we awaken the oldest story. Because in changing the earth, we also risk forgetting how little control we truly have. The flood is not an enemy, it is a response, a return to balance through correction. The ancients may not have had satellites or science, but they had stories, and those stories were right, not in the details of dates or measurements, but in the truth of consequence. Live without balance, and the waters will rise. The ark, in this context, becomes a metaphor not just for survival, but for stewardship. What do we choose to carry into the future? What values? What memories? What songs? The flood does not only drown, it filters. And what passes through is what we build from next. In this way, we are always building arcs. Each act of kindness, each preservation of culture, each garden, each child held close, is a beam, a plank, a rope. Together, they form the vessel that may one day carry us through. There is a kind of quiet wisdom that follows the flood, a softness in the way people step on the ground afterward, as if the land might still shift beneath them. It's the hush of reverence, of knowing that everything is borrowed, that nothing, no matter how solid, lasts forever. That awareness is a gift. The flood takes much, but it leaves something behind, too. Clarity, the understanding that life is not about accumulation, but connection. That the things we cling to may weigh us down, and that what floats is often invisible. Hope, love, story, faith. In the flood stories, this truth is embedded not in the climax, but in the aftermath. The rebuilding is never grand at first. It begins with the smallest gestures, a seed pressed into damp soil, a shelter shaped from fallen branches, a song sung to a frightened child. These are the roots of civilization, not monuments or gold, but care. The survivors never forget, and so they tell the story not just to inform, but to prepare. Every generation must know what happened, so they can be ready if it happens again. This is why the flood story became myth, not because it was untrue, but because it had to last. It had to move through time, unchanged in essence, even if reshaped in form. And so we find it everywhere, in stone and syllable, in symbol and silence, a single thread running through the tapestry of humanity. The flood connects us, not by blood, but by memory. Even in places untouched by water, the story lives, in fire-prone forests, in drought-stricken plains, in trembling earth, because the flood, ultimately, is not about water alone. It is about disruption, about what we do when everything we know is undone, and about who we become when we rise from it. Some say the story of the flood is overused, too familiar, but perhaps its familiarity is its power. We recognize it not because it's been repeated too much, but because it lives within us. We know it in our bones. We dream of it. We write it without realizing, because we are part of it. And in telling it again, we don't just preserve the past, we shape the future. We remind ourselves that the flood may come, but so too will land, that the night may be long, but morning follows, that no matter how wide the water, something always floats. That something is us. Long after the flood, when the land has dried and the memory begins to settle like dust in forgotten corners, a different kind of work begins. The survivors have rebuilt homes, planted fields, raised children, but now they must begin to shape meaning, to understand not just what happened, but why it matters. This is where philosophy is born, where myth gives way to reflection. The flood, in its terrible grandeur, forces humanity to ask deeper questions. Who are we, truly? What is worth preserving? What does it mean to start again? In this space of quiet inquiry, the flood becomes more than a story of water. It becomes a mirror to the soul. The waters that drowned the earth now reflect the faces of those who survived. And they see themselves differently, smaller, perhaps, but also more aware, more grounded, more connected. The questions lead to rituals, ceremonies that mark the turning of seasons, the arrival of rain, the retreat of storms. Fire becomes sacred not only for warmth, but as a symbol of clarity. Earth is honored because it gave footing after chaos. Water is approached with reverence because it carries both life and loss. Temples rise where the water once flowed. Inscriptions carved deep into stone remind future generations not to forget. Myths are not warnings alone, they are instructions, blueprints drawn with metaphor and mystery. The ark becomes the mind, the mountain becomes truth, the dove becomes hope renewed. And yet, the flood is not static. As humanity spreads, the story travels too. It takes new forms. In one land, it is a punishment. In another, a reset. In yet another, a gift. The interpretations multiply, but the heart remains unchanged. Something was lost. Something was saved. And in between those truths lies the whole of human meaning. Even today, we seek to understand the flood in new ways. Scientists read the Earth's layers like sacred text. Anthropologists trace the parallels across continents. Writers reimagine the story in novels, films, songs. The language has changed, but the longing has not. We still want to know, what does the flood mean? Perhaps it is not meant to have a single meaning. Perhaps it means what it needs to, depending on the age, the people, the storm. Sometimes it is a tale of warning, sometimes of cleansing, sometimes of grief, sometimes of grace. That is its power, its endurance. And in this, the flood becomes timeless. It is not bound to one event, one place, one people. It belongs to all of us. It is the river beneath our civilization, sometimes visible, sometimes buried, but always flowing. And when we hear the story again, even if we've heard it 100 times, we feel something stir. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. The rain begins with a single drop. The flood begins with a trickle. Change begins in silence. This truth sits quietly at the center of every flood story. The awareness that what undoes the world is not always sudden. Sometimes it is slow, incremental. The water rises by inches before it crashes by waves. And in that gradual shift, many fail to notice, or notice but do not act, or act too late. In this way, the flood is also a story of attention, of seeing clearly, of knowing when balance is shifting, and having the courage to respond. This is what separates the ark builders from the rest, not knowledge alone, but the willingness to live differently. And so the story calls to each of us in personal ways. Where is the water rising in your life? What warnings are whispering at the edge of your awareness? What habits, what attachments, what illusions are weighing your vessel down? Because we are all carrying something, and when the waters comey as they always do, must decide what floats. Not everything can be saved. Not everything should be. The flood reveals the essence by washing away the excess. In myth, the flood is often followed by a covenant, a promise, a new understanding between the divine and the mortal, the earth and its people, the past and the future. The rainbow is not simply a beautiful symbol, it is a declaration that life will continue, that we will not forget. But memory must be tended, carried forward, not just in stories, but in choices, in how we treat the land, in how we build our cities, in how we speak to one another. Every act is a plank in the ark, every kindness a sail, every remembrance a rudder. And so the flood remains, not as a fear, but as a foundation, a reminder that nothing is permanent, and yet everything is possible. That from the deepest waters we rise, that from silence we sing again, that from loss we begin. Not because we are unbreakable, but because we remember. The survivors of the flood were never the same. How could they be? To lose everything and still remain, it changes something inside. Not just fear, not just sorrow, but a deeper shift, a new lens through which all things are seen. Every river becomes a question, every cloud a memory, every calm day a gift. But from this change came a different kind of strength. Not the strength to conquer, but the strength to endure, to adapt, to remember. And that strength flowed into the next generation, and the next, until it became culture, story, myth. This is why flood myths are so central, not just in religious texts, but in identity itself. People remember who they are by remembering what they survived. They trace their lineage not just to kings and warriors, but to those who built, who floated, who waited, who saw the end, and still chose to begin again. In these stories, we often overlook the smallest characters, the animals, the birds, the seeds, yet they are as central as the hero. Because survival is not just about the human story, it's about the web of life that surrounds us. The ark does not carry a man alone. It carries a world. And that world is preserved, not because it is powerful, but because it is precious. Each pair of animals, each grain, each sprig of green is a vote for tomorrow. A quiet declaration that life is worth continuing, that the new world will need all its voices, not just ours. This is why, in many indigenous traditions, the flood is not seen as a judgment, but as a renewal, a cleansing of imbalance, a sacred return to beginnings. After the waters, people walk more softly, speak more carefully, listen more fully, because they have heard the silence, and they know what it costs. In modern times, when floods are captured by drone footage and measured by satellites, it is easy to forget the story. We see the facts, the footage, the damage reports. But beneath all that data, the old truth remains. Each flood is a threshold, a test, a choice. We can rebuild without memory, or we can rebuild with meaning. And meaning does not always come in grand visions. Sometimes it is found in the way we help a neighbor, the way we teach our children, the way we sit in the dark and tell the old stories again. Not because we are afraid, but because we are alive. And what of the ark? It is easy to imagine it as a boat, a structure, a container of wood and pitch. But the ark is more than that. It is a symbol of intention, of love carried through chaos, of foresight and faith, of building something strong not just to escape the flood but to protect the future. In that sense, every act of preparation becomes sacred. Planting a tree, writing a song, preserving a language. These are arks, tiny vessels that carry the essence of humanity forward. Each one designed not just to float, but to deliver something vital to the shore beyond the storm. The ark also teaches a lesson about boundaries. It is not infinite. Not everything fits inside. Choices must be made. What do we value? What must be left behind? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones, and they invite us to live with greater awareness. Many modern flood myths in film, in literature, in imagination, explore this question. In stories of apocalypse, we see bunkers, ships, stars, but the core remains the same. What survives? And why? Some say the ark is outdated, that we don't need myth anymore. But perhaps we've misunderstood the myth. It's not about the boat, it's about the builder, the one who sees the signs, who listens, who acts, who does not wait for certainty, but moves with conviction. We all carry that builder within us, that quiet sense that something must be protected, that the world is beautiful but fragile, that storms come, but so does morning. And so we prepare not in fear but in love, not in panic but in purpose. The ark is not an escape. It is a commitment to endure, to preserve, to carry forward what matters most. And when the time comes, when the waters rise again in whatever form they take, we remember the story, not as warning, but as invitation. To build, to carry, to begin again. In the aftermath of the flood, time begins again. Calendars are marked not from the birth of kings, but from the moment the waters receded. Civilizations re-emerge, shaped by the memory of what came before. Festivals honor the rising sun, the returning stars, the regrowth of green. These are not just seasonal celebrations. They are quiet victories over chaos. And with each new dawn, the survivors and their descendants write the world anew, not always in stone or on paper, but in how they walk, how they speak, how they build. A city designed with space for rivers to flood safely. A community that shares food during a drought. A song that honors the rain but also prays for restraint. These are acts of remembrance. The flood teaches us that nothing lasts, but that what we learn can. And so, over time, the story becomes sacred. It is passed from mouth to ear with care, not to frighten but to guide. The storyteller becomes the protector of balance, the keeper of warnings, the voice of resilience, around fires, in temples, beneath stars. The story is told again and again. Once, there was too much. Once, we lost everything. But we remembered, we rebuilt, and we still carry what matters. In some versions, the flood is not the end, but one of many cycles. Worlds come and go, ages rise and fall. Each flood cleanses not just the land, but the soul. Humanity, in this telling, is always returning, always learning, always growing. This idea that we are part of something larger, something rhythmicist, not meant to diminish us, it is meant to connect us, to show that our stories are not isolated, that your flood is my flood, that your ark holds a place for me and mine for you. The flood, then, becomes a symbol of unity, a story that spans language, culture, and belief, a reminder that we are all downstream from someone else's storm, that what we save today is not just for ourselves, but for those who will need it tomorrow. When we look back on the oldest writings of humankind, it is striking how many begin not with birth, but with loss, not with perfection, but with disaster. The first tablets, the first scrolls, the first carved stones, they remember the flood, not because it was the only story worth telling, but because it was the one we couldn't afford to forget. It is the story of humility, of listening when no one else will, of building quietly while the world laughs, of choosing life when the skies turn dark. It is the story of endurance, not as glory, but as grace. And in this story is a hidden hope, because the flood does not just take, it reveals. It strips away illusion and leaves behind the truth that we are not separate from nature, that we are not invincible, but we are capable, we are adaptable, and we are bound to one another. What one loses, another must carry. What one remembers, another must pass on. The ark is never built alone. Even in myth, it takes hands, hearts, animals, time. It takes trust. It takes the willingness to protect what cannot yet protect itself. In the years after the flood, stories speak of new laws, new dreams, new kinds of beauty, music that mimics the rhythm of rain, dances that honor the cleansing, paintings that carry the shape of waves. This is the art of recovery, the art of making meaning from loss. And perhaps that is the greatest power of the flood story, not the event itself, but what it inspires, the way it shapes the soul, the way it asks each of us, what would you carry? What would you save? Because in that question lies the answer to who we are. Now, the flood is still with us, but not as a threat, as a guide, as a presence in the background of all we do. We build better, not just for storms, but for silence. We listen closer, not just for rain, but for rhythm. We live not just in pursuit of more, but in appreciation of enough. The flood taught us that, and so we move forward, not as those who were spared, but as those who remember. We remember the sound of rain on the roof of the ark, the groan of trees beneath rising water, the stillness of a sky that no longer weeps. We remember the dove, the branch, the shore. We remember what it felt like to begin again. And we know, deep in the quiet places of our hearts, that we will be asked to begin again someday, somehow. Not with the same storm, perhaps, but with the same call to carry, to float, to rebuild. This is why we tell the story. This is why it lasts. Not for fear, not for glory, but for memory. Because in remembering the flood, we remember ourselves. And in remembering ourselves, we find the way home. And now, the waters have calmed. The sky has cleared. And what was once lost has been remembered. You've journeyed through myth and memory, through fear and hope, through the silence after the storm. May this story stay with you, like the sound of rain on a quiet night, like a ripple on still water, gentle, enduring, true. Sleep now, dream deeply, and when you rise, rise like the world did, with peace in your heart and the strength to begin again. Good night.